Welcome to the Right to Know opening Pandora's box. I'm Claire Fox and I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas, for those of you who don't know me. Intellectually, it's very important for us to get to grips with the cult of transparency today. There isn't really any situation today when the solution is not forward that we need more transparency. We're told that everything should be in the public eye. If you're a journalist now, it's constantly the case that journalism will use freedom of information requests to find out what's going on behind closed doors. Often, if you argue in defence of privacy even, people will say, well, of course we with individuals' privacy, but there's a slight lurking suspicion that possibly you've got something rather dodgy to hide if you're actually arguing about privacy. And, of course, we then have the added complication of social media. Social media, which means that even if you've got a secret, it's very hard to keep it. That it can be broken on Twitter, on Facebook. What's more is we willingly seem to be prepared to let it all hang out on those medium, that we actually will say, I believe in privacy, but I'm going to tell you the most intimate aspects of my life and share it with people. And those of you who are on Twitter will know that some people do, as they say in the trade, overshare. And we are over-familiar with the intimate details of far too many people's lives because they decide to tell us about it on Twitter. So maybe we just should have a more open society. This is a good thing. We know more. It's a fabulous atmosphere to live in. Or maybe it's the case that there's something slightly gone wrong. And that, in fact, rather than transparency being a solution for our climate of mistrust, that if we know more, we'll be reassured, maybe actually the more we know, the more suspicious and distrustful we get. So that's the kind of thing that we're going to look at today. Okay, so first of all, we're going to start with Kirk Leach, who has previously been chairing a discussion on lobbying. For those of you who were in, you'll know him. Kirk works in government affairs for the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry. He's a Battle of Ideas regular and has previously spoken when he worked for Understand Animal Research, which was a leading lobby group on the use of animals in medical research. He's a regular blogger for the Huffington Post, and the main thing is whenever he's put on events and discussions at the Battle of Ideas or spoken at them, he's always added an interesting angle and been fairly forthright in his views on what he thinks. Next up will be Gilly Lord, who is a partner at PwC's assurance practice and advises financial services clients on the application of regulation and liaising with the regulator and leads regulatory investigations. Obviously, all of those issues in many ways concerned with issues around transparency and what we know and what should be known. PwC are headline partners, and the whole issue around transparency and whether it's a solution to trust has been one of the things we've been interested in pursuing. Third up will be Andrew Keane. He's an entrepreneur, a founder of audiocafe.com, the author of Digital Vertigo, How Today's Online Social Revolution is Dividing, Diminishing and Disorientating Us. He's also the author of the international hit, The Cult of the Amateur, which is published in 17 different languages. Next up will be Stephen Barber. Stephen is the Group Managing Director of Group Communications at Pictet & Chi, Switzerland's largest private bank. And also, he runs the leading global photography prize, Pre-Pictet, the subject of which is sustainability, which was established in 2008. And I was recently at this year's award-giving ceremony, and the standard of photography of the shortlist was absolutely exemplary and extraordinary. But I'm also delighted personally to have Stephen here, because this is an issue that we've discussed quite a lot. Finally, we've got Professor Roger Grafe. Roger, I don't think has ever spoken at the Battle of Ideas, but I've known him for many years. He's one of the preeminent documentary filmmakers in this country and indeed internationally. He's the CEO of Films of Record, an award-winning filmmaker, including a BAFTA-winning police series. He's been awarded a BAFTA Fellowship for Lifetime Achievement and OBE. He's the founding board member of Channel 4. He's the chair of the Media Standards Trust. He's basically a kind of very well-known, sticking his nose in everywhere journalist type. Kirk, kick us off.
I'd like to make 3 points, really. Firstly, that the current obsession with transparency reveals a domination of rules and regulation of process over public life today. Secondly, that freedom of information and transparency are not the same as democracy and will actually weaken democracy. And finally, a thought or two about whistleblowing. no week passes these days without some politician talking about transparency, and the issue of transparency dominates kind of public life. Last week, Ed Miliband called for more transparency of the rising gas prices. 2 weeks before that, it was about rip-off pension schemes. Nick Clegg last week announced support for new transparency laws covering the extractive industries. A few weeks before then, he was talking about the need for transparency over the effectiveness of government procurement, what government buys. Cameron is a transparency addict, actually. If you were to run through the list of things he wants to be transparent about, we'll be here till next Monday. And predictably, his first response to the coming row about MPs being landlords to other MPs was to call for more transparency. The industry I work in, the pharmaceutical industry, not known for its openness, is about to see an unprecedented move towards greater disclosure of payments towards health providers, down to the amount of cups of tea and coffee that GSK pay for GPs. For radical NGOs and protesters, what do we want troops out when you want it now has become what do we want greater transparency when we want it yesterday. Any group or campaign that wants to be taken seriously within the public domain has in its manifesto a demand for greater transparency. And I think the supremacy of the transparency word is very new and very fast. However, from a kind of cultural and historical point of view, it's not particularly clear what transparency actually means, not particularly self-evident. But today, what transparency means and the way it's being used in public life is in the introduction of process, of rules and regulations that determine what is right and what is wrong in public life. And how transparent an organisation is has really now become the litmus test of how we judge it and the individuals who work for it. So when something is deemed to be unacceptable, it's not really a question of whether it's morally right or wrong, or whether it's truly damaging to society. It's because it's violated the process. Some form has not been signed, some meeting has not been acknowledged, some donation not declared. I think one of the most disturbing consequences of this obsession with transparency is the modern addiction to rule-making. The institutionalisation of process inevitably begets more rules. It creates a demand for auditors and new processes to ensure that regulations are followed. What we have is rule and regulation creep. For example, look at the BBC's response to the sex abuse claims against Jimmy Savile and how did he get away with it. 2 inquiries are launched. One, firstly, were the procedures followed which by Newsnight should have carried out that programme? And secondly, what were the cultural practices and norms of the 1970s? I mean, whatever one thinks about the accusations around Jimmy Savile, though, as an aside, I think it would be useful from a year ahead to look back at the peculiar mix of lynch mob, historical amnesia, salacious tittle-tattle and outright panic. Whatever thinks about the Jimmy Savile thing, one can see the response to the BBC to this whole thing is just a ritual. It's simply a form of impression management, something employed and dragged out to alleviate public angst, an empty cliché signaling the victory of rhetoric over content. Secondly, the obsession with freedom of information and transparency, I think, are part of a wider audit culture which emerged out of the financial scandals of the 1990s, and that has now morphed into public life. For many people, open government, FOI, transparency, is a way to improve democracy. It's not often I quote Jemima Khan, but on the steps of the court where Julian Assange was being arraigned, she said, "I'm here because I believe this is about the principle of the universal right of freedom and information, and our right to be told the truth. This is democracy in action." I mean, a cursory examination of the 30 articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights shows that, compendious as it is, it contains no such freedom of information process. But that assumption that we're always being lied to, that we have a right to know the truth, has become so established in the liberal mindset, it's taken on the form of a universal truth. I think one of the consequences of this process is to encourage people to put their trust in third parties, such as Transparency International, WikiLeaks and fact-checker websites, with the effect of creating a spiral of mistrust between citizens and professionals and politicians, weakening democracy. So although FOI requests may be introduced in the name of restoring trust and empowering citizens, I would argue it has the opposite effect. It creates a culture of cynicism and suspicion. Another problem is that this institutionalisation of transparency does little but encourage dishonesty and deception within the organisations targeted. Take the events this week where there was an attempt to get Prince Charles, the government, to release 16 letters that Prince Charles has sent to the government in the hope of revealing his political leanings. Being a lifelong Republican that I am, I can work out for myself what the political leanings of the Duchy of Cornwall are, and they certainly aren't mine. But just imagine that if this move had been successful, the only consequence of this would have been a return to scrawled notes on the backs of envelopes and secret whispers in corridors. And that's because the imperative of transparency forces people to be always on the guard and to be reluctant to write things down. As somebody who's been a campaigner on many issues which people might find quaint today, such as Britain's war in Ireland, official secrecy was enforced by such legislation as the Official Secrets Act and used to protect the interests of the state at the expense of ordinary people. However, I think today's clamour for openness is also a threat to democracy. A totally open and honest, transparent system in which every whisper and row is made public will stultify political debate and intensify an existing authoritarian instinct. For those who see transparency as opening the doors to inner secrets of government, all it does is push important conversation to the margins of corridors. Quickly on whistleblowing. I recently watched the film All the President's Men about Watergate and Deep Throat. The insider gave journalists Bernstein and Edwards information that led to the downfall of President Nixon. And it made me really think about how culturally the way we think about leaking and whistleblowing has completely flipped. Leaking or disclosing information today is perceived as used to be perceived as an act of disloyalty, irresponsibility and betrayal. However, today it's secrecy, confidentiality and privacy that is stigmatised. Once an act of disloyalty is now seen as a heroic deed of a brave person. Obviously, leaking and whistleblowing can show up serious problems with institutions. They can reveal facts unknown. However, I no longer think that this is about the plucky little guy fighting the system against a corporate state. When you do as WikiLeaks, put a ton of information onto the web, you're no longer poacher, you become gamekeeper. Where is the responsibility for that? Who indeed guards the guards? WikiLeaks slashes and burns with no impunity or accountability. The real damage done by the modern celebration of leaking is cynicism and mistrust.
So, Gilly, your thoughts on the question?
Okay, thanks, Claire. So, in preparing for today's session, I wanted to think about responsible transparency. Personally, I am a big supporter of transparency and I would push for more information to be available in the public domain. But if we get that increased transparency, we also get new responsibility. And that's responsibility for those of us who own information, of course, but also responsibility for those of us who use information, the general public. And really important responsibility, which Kirk's already touched on, for intermediaries, for those who take information and package it and present it for us to use. So I said I was a supporter of transparency. Why is that? I want me and my family to live in a society where we can make informed decisions about politics and social policies, about our choices as consumers, about our investments and so on. But to make those informed decisions, I have to have access to a complete data set, not a condensed, redacted, cleansed data set that a politician or a big corporate has decided that I can cope with. But that brings me to my first area of responsibility. If I get this access to an increased level of information from government or from politicians or from whoever, what are my responsibilities? What am I going to do with that information? What information do I want to use? How is it going to make me feel? So if I've got access to the information, I can't moan afterwards about the wrong decision being taken because I should have shouted before the decision was taken. So if we're asking for more transparency, we have to take the responsibility that comes with it and start thinking and contributing. So I'm an accountant, as Claire said, and I largely work with large corporate clients in the preparation of their accounts. So their accounts, or at least the ones of my clients, always comply with accounting standards, disclosure requirements, of course. But if I were to take many sets of big corporate accounts and give them to my sister, who's a consultant in the NHS, they would probably be completely meaningless to her. They're full of accounting speak, complex disclosures. Often they can be completely opaque. So real transparency, and there are some companies who get this right, are about taking a large set of complex data, a set of accounts, a select committee report, whatever it is, and producing it in a way that my sister can read, can understand, can make decisions on the back of. And it's not just about putting out a vast amount of complex data and just churning that out mindlessly. So that's real responsible transparency. So the third area of responsibility that's created in this new world of mine of increased transparency surrounds the role of the intermediaries. So those people that take the large volumes of data, that package it for the public to use. And this is a huge responsibility. How do we know they're getting it right? How do we know we're not just getting somebody's personal opinion, somebody's personal slice of the facts? So for intermediaries, I think often we do need much more responsible behaviour. First of all, I'd like to see clarity over the objectives of intermediaries. If I'm reading somebody's personal blog, I know I'm getting somebody's personal opinion. It is going to be subjective. If I'm reading a newspaper, am I really getting an objective account of all the facts or not? And the media in particular, I think, have a critical role here. And unfortunately, I think we have some bad examples of where that role has been abused and some good examples where it's been used well. But in the worst examples, we've seen public hysteria being really whipped up, often with commercial goals in mind. So I see a need for more consistent challenge of the media and of intermediaries in general. We need them to acknowledge the responsibilities that come with being an intermediary and to live by them. And as the public, we have to appreciate and demand, comprehensive and balanced reporting. So we're back to where I started with the idea of public responsibility. We can't demand increased transparency without acknowledging our own responsibilities.
So I think this is a very interesting subject, transparency. I don't always say that about every subject. We seem to be living in a culture of deep distrust of authority on every level. In America, of course, you see this, but I think it's true in England as well. A distrust of all the traditional forms of 20th century meritocracy, from politicians to academics, bankers, of course. Much of this is justified. Much of this can be explained in terms of events at the beginning of the 21st century. But it's more than just that. You talked about public hysteria. I think there is a public hysteria about authority, about how you get authority, why you have it. And much of this longing, this cult, this fetishization of transparency lies in our deep distrust of the traditional sources of authority, the church, the state, politics, expertise, accountancy, law, the professions. Now, I don't understand why this has happened. I mean, there are many, many reasons for it. But at the same time this is going on, we have the technology of radical leveling, of radical democratization, which the quote-unquote, the people, the masses, people like you out there, have the means, the power to challenge authority. You know, WikiLeaks is the extreme example. The blogosphere, the internet, reality television, the media in general. So what we're having, I think, and this is a profound historical shift, is this shift from the 19th, 20th century industrial economic meritocracy of professional elites to something else. Now, skeptics, anti-democrats, elitists like myself would say that we're at the age of digital mob rule. Some of you might say that this is a good thing. I mean, in some ways it is a good thing. I'm not necessarily completely against WikiLeaks. But it's a broad cultural phenomenon that defines every aspect of our political, economic, social, cultural lives. And there's something else as well, which is particularly interesting. I was at the Frank Furedi thing today, and he made some really interesting points about the erosion of the distinction between public and private life. So at the same time this is going on, at the same time you have this populist backlash against traditional structures of authority, you have the disappearance or the breakdown in the traditional distinction between the public and the private. Politics in particular has become dominated with privacy and with scandal, but the same is true across the board. So our fetish with transparency itself now is not so much a fetish with the public, but with the private. So when we talk about transparency, you have these endless scandals, sexual scandals, personal scandals, marriage scandals, scandals not about the traditional political, but about the personal. So all in all, what we're seeing is the emergence of what I would call a kind of a confessional democracy. In his wonderful book, Protestant Ethic, The Origins of Capitalism, Max Weber argued that what happened was that the Industrial Revolution transformed the monastery into the world. And in a peculiar kind of way, what's happening in the early part of the 21st century is that the confessional has become the world. Are there any Roman Catholics here? I hope I won't. I do hope I offend you. But what we're seeing then is this sort of levelized, plebiscitary confessional. And when you take it together within the electronic culture of our digital media, we have this supposed trust economy. But we don't trust on professional lines. We trust on personal lines. So Frank Furedi said that the traditional trope on British media, the thing that people always ask is, how do you feel? And that's how we trust people. And that's why the successful characters of this sort of plebiscitary confessional age are people like Arianna Huffington, people who are skilled in the construction of authenticity. So we have, not only with the cult of transparency, we have this cult of authenticity, this idea of being true. That's why I pride myself on lying. I pride myself on being as inauthentic as I possibly can, which is, of course, another kind of trap, which is another form of authenticity. So it's impossible to get out of, really. Overall, though, I do fear this. I do fear that we are living in this mob rule of trust, this kind of show state culture, particularly in the electronic sphere, which doesn't know how to forget. So one bad mark, one drunken exploit, one inappropriate grope, one button undone at the wrong time can mean that our lives get ruined. I fear then that this, and perhaps it comes from America with its obsession with guilt and sin and a culture which is deeply unforgiving. I fear that we are heading towards a kind of digital Protestantism. We're seeing the rebirth of Luther and Calvin in an electronic form, one which hasn't remembered how to forget. So this is a big issue, one that I think we have to address in a broad cultural sense and think, how can we get out of this and maintain the autonomy of the individual and forgetting and memory and all that kind of thing? Thank you.
I think it goes back quite a long way further than we've been saying today. And I just brought a picture. You said I wasn't allowed to use pictures, but I brought you to show you something which is, if you can see here, this is a carving by the medieval sculptor Giselbertus, and it's in the cathedral at Autun, and it shows Eve reaching back behind her and surreptitiously taking the apple from the tree of knowledge. And there you can see, a bit closer up there, and you can see that kind of rather seductive expression on her face. And of course, what Adam and Eve were doing was demanding of God the right to know. So I guess that was the first demand for transparency. And ever since then, the right to have wisdom, the right to know the difference between good and evil, and ever since then it's been a sort of tension between the demand for knowledge and the submission to that authority. And I see nobody here has mentioned the word privacy, and I got interested in this because, with conversations with Claire, when the OECD, Switzerland, accepted the Article 26 of the OECD Convention in March 2009, and it meant effectively the beginning of the end of what was called Swiss banking secrecy. Now, how does that relate to transparency? Well, I think that, the radical transparency movement, if you like, and someone like David Brin, for example, would represent that, is all about giving the people the power to resist the control of elites. I mean, we talked here about the right to know versus the right to privacy, and those are the two poles, I think, of this. And every right, as John Rawls said, comes with a countervailing obligation. And so, what's the obligation that we have? Our right to know from government. What obligation do we have? I think, of course, it's the obligation to operate within the law, and our right to privacy, to protect our private interests from the government, of course, also comes with that same obligation. But if you ask me, where do I stand on this debate? I mean, I actually believe that the government in this country, beginning with the Blair government and really continuing under Cameron, has become more and more authoritarian in the policies they'd introduced and giving further powers to the police to intrude on our personal space. And, you know, I speak from experience of having 3 teenage sons who have been treated appallingly at the hands of the police. And when I go to the police, been to the police station there and tried to get access to them, talk to them, I've been treated in a way, I mean, the police are completely unaccountable in my experience. I mean, they've raided my house, they kept my sons effectively prisoner for 2 or 3 hours before they allowed one of them to actually call me. And when I came home, and when I came home, they actually started behaving themselves, according to my sons. And the stories that they told about the way they were intimidated, they were completely innocent of anything, by the way, intimidated. And when they found some baking powder in my 15-year-old's room and accused him of having a stash of cocaine, which led to 3 months of real anxiety on his behalf before we finally got him off. They didn't believe us. So, I mean, that's the kind of invasion of privacy and the kind of strengthening of, you know, unaccountable powers that has happened, I think, under the Blair governments. And I know it's nothing to do with financial privacy, but, I mean, that's one of the issues that I really feel strongly about.
First of all, you'll be glad to know I violently disagree with 2 of the speakers, Kirk on my left and Andrew on the far right there. And I do agree with Gilly saying that responsible use of information is important. But the tool we have, because what Stephen's saying is true about getting more and more authoritarian about laws and invasion of privacy and so on, is information. That is our protection. There is, many years ago now, maybe 20 years ago, Le Monde published an article talking about the new aristocracy of information, that the people who were in a certain group of elite civil servants and politicians and businessmen and so on and scientists shared information with each other quite freely. The internet, as you will undoubtedly know, was created by scientists to talk to each other and so on. And that's the web, I guess, one of the other reasons. But at any rate, there was this notion that they were okay to talk to, but the world outside was dangerous if you let people know what was going on. And this whole saga of investigative journalism scandals from T. Dan Smith in Newcastle and all the things that happened in the 60s and 70s, the police scandals that were exposed in the 70s, the firm within the firm, all of that thing was resisted fiercely as somehow weakening government respect for authority, as Andrew's talking. If authority doesn't deserve respect, it shouldn't have it. And the only way we can keep authority in check is by them knowing that sooner or later, one way or another, we are likely to find out. Now, the blogosphere, the problem with the blogosphere and Wikipedia, not WikiLeaks, is that people can manipulate it, of course, and there's no checking. The problem with 24/7 media is that the whole brigade of journalists who might, under other circumstances, have been trained properly and look for 3 sources and go to original sources, now use each other as a source. So Kirk and people who are trying to put out responsible information will find that one distortion gets amplified and amplified in a kind of terrible megaphone effect because nobody's bothered to go back to the original source. And although Claire, I think it was a compliment, said that I stick my nose in where other people don't want to be and film them when they don't want to be filmed. In fact, it's the opposite. We do some investigations, but most of the films we make are saying to people, nobody understands you. The version of your experience that's out there is distorted and caricatured. What you really need is a long 3, 4 month, 6 month, 9 month, year-long observational film to be made about this, which you will check for accuracy and confidentiality. And the one I'm going to cite to you, which you may have seen, that I'm very proud of, was Great Ormond Street. We did 9 films inside Great Ormond Street. And we told the great untold secret, which is that children die. There have been many, many children's hospital films, but none of the kids ever died because they thought that was bad for early evening viewing. And we took the risk, and the hospital took the risk, of giving us cases where they didn't know. Right? Crucially, these top consultants in the world did not know what to do, and they admitted it on camera. We filmed real discussions. And in the first 3 films we did, the hospital itself was terribly worried that once that kind of Pandora's box was opened, that people would no longer give money because they thought these doctors were not, omnipotent. In fact, it was the opposite. Their giving went up. The people who ran fun runs and things gave money to them because of our series, and creating a kind of playing field which is not only level, but includes a kind of human factor that people get things wrong, is what's missing so much of the time from this parallel reality in which drug trials are only successful because the unsuccessful ones are not published. And we've done films in which we found the unsuccessful ones only by going to America, where the criteria are more demanding. And other examples of that are consultants who are paid for by the drug companies and then publish flattering reports. The distortion of what looks like reliable information is a constant struggle for those of us who are responsible journalists. And when we get responsible information, we think we use it in a way that informs the electorate. And Andrew was talking about this, he's an anti-democrat, as he said. But I believe in informed electorates. I was actually on the government committee for public involvement in planning, and I cannot tell you how much resistance there was to involve the public in decisions that would affect them. And right now, we're about to publish a report next Friday from the RIBA, which I've looked at for a year now, on housing, future of housing. One of our calls is for greater transparency about the information to do with houses. And right now, if you went out to buy a house or a box of breakfast cereal, I can tell you which one you'd find out more about. It's the cereal. That the lack of information in that situation is terrible. It's the biggest decision anyone will make, and they can hardly find anything out. And one of the reasons, and to pick up Kirk's point, it's interesting, is that there is a law requiring that any information published about a house has to be accurate, or you're liable legally. So the house builders tell us, well, of course, then we don't bother. And you say, well, hold on, what about providing accurate information? That way you won't get prosecuted. And there is a sense in which Kirk's description of people talking in corridors and making decisions in corridors, well, that was happening before Blair passed FOI, we know that. And only through the Hutton report were we able to find out the email trail which showed that the famous claim about 45 minutes and the WMD was from a thesis in a California postgraduate student being grabbed into the Scholar report. That's ridiculous. It's, Jonathan Swift would have been embarrassed to put it in there, but it was true, and there was a war started because of it. And so what are we doing here? When we say, do we trust our authorities when they're doing things like that and then hiding it? Answer, no, because the danger is if we trust them and don't keep them up to the mark, they will just revert back to the idea that disclosure is in some way must be embarrassing. What we say is responsible information helps people to support you, especially if you admit these things are hard, that there isn't an easy answer. And the American election is the most vivid example of that, with both sides avoiding the tough questions and in 3 minutes trying to parody each other's version of events. That's not good for democracy.
Well, in fact, Stephen used the kind of the tree of knowledge, and the kind of right to know can also be the right to knowledge. And how do you kind of square that, Kirk, in a way? Because one of the things that's happened with Leveson as well is this idea that, celebrities use the privacy issue, and people in power use the libel laws, for example. Everyone kind of wants to, it looks like there's a lot of people trying to hide things, whereas you're actually saying, fair enough, they're trying to hide them, or are you? I mean, can you kind of answer that kind of point?
I mean, obviously, the imperative behind a lot of the kind of demands for greater openness and transparency for information is the idea that somehow us having this kind of the democracy of knowledge is going to improve our decision making and help us to reveal what happens within society, within government. And I think, as well-meaning as that might be, I think it actually has the opposite effect. I think, one, because it kind of like destroys the ability for people to involve kind of informal exchanges amongst themselves. If you think that imagine that you're sitting at home and you're discussing something with your girlfriend or your wife or your lover kind of thing, how are you going to work something out? And you know that at some point somebody's going to ask you to explain your decision making. All it's going to do is create a kind of conservative approach. The people are not going to be fully open about what they say. And I think that is the result of this obsession with knowledge. It actually doubles back on itself. It leads to a much more kind of cynical approach, because the essence of it is you're looking for, as Americans would say, the zinger, the one secret which reveals something. And these things just never stop. And if you look at the whole freedom of information, actually, it never stops. People want to know more. Why didn't you say this? Why didn't you say that? It's a constant search for truth. And the idea that truth comes through knowing more about how government works internally, I think the opposite happens. People will become cynical because you won't get the truth through the decision-making that you find in the government.
Yeah, I mean, Roger, I wanted to ask, this is nothing to do with the kind of work you do, but just as sort of what's going on. I mean, freedom of information requests from journalists have become a substitute for investigative journalism. And I think the point that certain people have made off the panel anyway, or how do you deal with this, is that everybody does their best to kind of subvert, it's because you're trying to avoid it. I mean, it doesn't feel as though it's based on a kind of enlightenment, even a kind of deep investigative approach to finding things out. It feels much more like a kind of show me everything, tell me everything, fairly arbitrary. No?
No, this is a complete parody of the problem. If any of you saw our film, for example, this summer, a Panorama special called The Truth About Sports Products, just before the Olympics, we went to the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine and said, here are all these claims in men's magazines. There were 490 of them, saying you can run faster, you get bigger, you get all these stronger and all these things. And we just said, we wrote to all these big companies, Nike and everybody else, and said, including GSK, who made Lucozade Sport, and we just said, prove it. Just give us the evidence. We didn't say you're all lying bastards. We just said very interesting claims. Just where is the science, please? And out of 498 claims, we got 3 that were up to the standard of NICE, of the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. And so then what happened in the social media, which Andrew would probably not be surprised by, is that the blogosphere went alive with a lot of people saying, how can you say, my protein shake isn't useful? I've been living off it for years. I've spent all this money. My trainers are not necessary. How can you say this? They didn't like it. But then there was a whole bunch of people that just said it's the usual Panorama bias. And we had to point out, we didn't say anything other than show us the evidence. And so the use of FOI to get responsible information, to back up decisions, why did you give the West Coast Main Line for the other train company? That's a really important question. And I do not trust civil servants, especially young, inexperienced people who don't know what evidence looks like, to be protected by silence. We need to know, and we can help them do it better.
I'm going to come back to you, Kirk, in a minute in relation to something I'm going to ask Gilly. And then kind of just... Because, Gilly, when you were saying about, as an accountant, if I showed my sister who's an NHS manager, she wouldn't be able to deal with all this. I mean, there was a bit of me that was thinking, I don't want you to show my accounts to your sister. I mean, although you do my accounts. But, the broad point is there anything that you think shouldn't be shown? I mean, in a business sense, is there not an area that, is that a kind of routine practice? Seriously, that kind of your accountant will go out and show people? Do you think that's good practice? Or are there not, and the reason I'm saying it is because we were having a discussion earlier about equality, and when I was involved in an argument about inequality, the demand was made that everybody should show their tax returns, everyone's bank account should be made in the public, and that when I said I didn't want that to happen, it was said to me by some very influential people, well, what have you got to hide? And I realised how far things had gone, which is that these things were always deemed to be sacred, right? I mean, I might not want everyone to know how much I earn, not because I'm doing anything dodgy, but because it's my business. I might even be embarrassed for you to find out how little I earn. The demand that I should show, and my refutation, might saying, no, I don't want, was immediately seen as something, oh, yes, well, we all know, blah-de-blah-de-blah, right? That's it. You're doomed. Were you arguing for that kind of approach?
Let me take your first point to start with. So the set of accounts, the metaphorical set of accounts that I was going to show my sister would be big corporate produces and publishes its accounts. So I'm not in the habit of taking my clients' stuff
but that's what I mean. So you do know that then That
So-
actually not everything should be transparent. That was the kind of point I was
So
making.
then the next question, I think, which arises is, well, okay, what else is there? They've published this set of accounts, but what happened before then? How did they get to those set of accounts? To pick up Kirk's point, what about the informal conversations and debates and arguments that took place in order to get there? So should they be available? And I would say, and I'll stick in the corporate world for now, I would say why not? But the problem we have is that as the public, I think we respond really, really badly to debate and challenge. We see people disagreeing and debating, and we throw up our hands in horror and think, gosh, well, that's terrible. What do you mean the board of a company fell out over something? Well, you know what, guys? Of course they did. That's their job, to have a really good debate and argument. So personally, I think companies should expose more of that challenge process. If they're making a big judgment, they should be proud to say, yeah, we had a really, really good debate about it. But we need to respond to that in the right way and not just be hysterical, to use that word again, and be all out of shape because we saw an argument. I guess your second point, though, is about personal privacy versus big transparency. So what I talked about earlier was, and these are my words, big transparency. So this is the big corporates or our political parties, our government. And yes, I do think they have a responsibility to be transparent. What does that mean for us as individuals? Because yeah, like you, I also like a degree of individual privacy. But I do think you have to acknowledge that if you push for transparency, you like your individual privacy, you've created a spectrum, and you won't get a perfect answer to say, I want all of this to be private, I can draw a circle around it, I want all of this to be transparent. You have to acknowledge there's going to be grey areas.
I'll give you an example of the way this works at the moment. I'm involved in, I'm not going to big it up, but fairly kind of delicate discussions with the major ferry companies in the UK and in Europe, and also Eurostar, to try and get them to begin to move animals back into the UK for research. Start this year, activists, through perfectly legal means, convinced the last ferry company in the UK not to move animals from Europe to the UK for pharmaceutical industries, but also for the Wellcome Trust, MRC, to do research. And these animals are important for business and also for research. They're critical, actually. Usually mice brought in to do research on. And yesterday, the Mori released a Mori poll showing there'd been a dip in support in the UK for animal research. Quite an interesting issue. For the last 3 weeks, BIS, the Business Information and Skills Department, have been inundated with FOI inquiries, literally 425 FOI inquiries to try and get the story. To the extent yesterday that the lady who organised the briefing for Mori, an FOI arrived, they want to know her phone calls with one particular civil servant. And this wasn't some kind of stalker after it, it was a leading journalist. And that's what it's come down to. It's come down to such a kind of like lazy, first of all, a lazy thing. But secondly, it's a situation where there's no need for that journalist to know what's going on. These are kind of delicate situations which the benefit of humanity, if you like, getting animals in. And yet somehow he thinks he has a right to know this information, which could destroy years and years of work to get this going. It is a peculiar moment where people think they have a right to know everything.
Andrew, I mean, I have certainly a lot of sympathy with the way you presented the case, and I think this sort of collapse in trust and authority is very important, profound, is the question of the moment, you know, in many ways. But it's just, it was interesting because Roger kind of just passed me a note a minute ago saying Enron. And, you know, there is this sort of idea that, you know, whilst I have some sympathy with what you're saying is, how do we deal with... Jilly's making the kind of distinction between big corporates or big organisations. You know, you said, you know, the churches, then the Catholic Church and paedophilia and all the rest of it. I mean, how do you deal with the fact that, although I can see what you're saying, but that there are people who are trying to hide bad things?
You know, I think that's given. I think the challenge for the left is to re-embrace authority. I think the only way in which the left can architect itself in this flattened, digital, democratized age is to reinterpret, rethink the meritocracy of the industrial age. I mean, someone was saying in your last panel, I think it was again Frank, that the left is, or I think that Bulgarian guy, that the left is now really conservative. And whereas some people would see that as a critique, I would think that that's actually a good thing. You know, what do you have if you don't have authority? Again, I'm not speaking in favor of some sort of ancien regime of inherited privilege. But what is replacing the old meritocracy? A kind of mob rule where celebrities seem to be acquiring more and more power. And there is a kind of a lacunae. There's a vacuum, which is politically incredibly dangerous. And I really do think it's important to understand all this in terms of the depoliticization of the public space. You're creating the perfect conditions for kind of mass mob leaders whose power will be built on their supposed authenticity, on their personal identities, and not on their political thinking.
The latest news, which was in yesterday's Herald Tribune or even this morning's, was about the Boy Scouts having hidden all this record of paedophilia. The Boy Scouts, right? A more international symbol of trust and authority you could hardly imagine. And I just go back to Iraq, I go back to Afghanistan, Karzai, all this kind of parallel. What you call the cult of authenticity, to me, is just the illusion of information.
I mean, corporations, if they're listed companies, they have shareholders who they have the power to make those companies accountable. If they don't exercise it, that's their fault. But it's very difficult to hold governments accountable. And it's even more difficult to hold transnational organizations. I mean, something like the European Union, which is completely corrupt and wastes huge quantities of our money. And we can't get inside there. So, you know, I'm absolutely for, you know, transparency towards those who hold power over us.
I think, again, there's this shame in power. I mean, what's the alternative? This idea that picking up Foucault and saying, well, we should see power everywhere and expose it. I mean, what's your point? So what? I mean, power is everywhere, and you've got, I think, rather than reading Foucault, we should be reading Machiavelli and begin to understand how we can actually idealize power and sympathize with it. Can I just say one thing in response to Roger? He brought up the Iraq war thing, right? And, you know, obviously in some ways he's right. The British and US governments were caught, in a sense, lying for a war which had at least some moral element. And what you're seeing as, you know, some people would say, oh, you know, we shouldn't have gone to war, blah, blah, blah. But what that has done in this culture of radical transparency where the authority of the government is undermined, you're seeing the inability of Western governments now to be able to respond to what's happening in Syria. So the lack of activity, this sort of pathetic attitude on the part, particularly of the US and the UK to Syria, is a result of that, direct result.
So, right to know, usually the principle is something like, those who have power over you, those you've abdicated a certain kind of responsibility to, are therefore answerable, and then there's going to be different gradations. So it's with respect to whom and with respect to what. And if that's the principle, then surely Roger's right with respect to whether it's the government or pharmaceutical companies or civil institutions like the Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts, where they are, in effect, ruling over certain aspects of our children's lives or our lives in our name, they are accountable to us, and that brings it with transparency. If you don't have transparency, people will do bad things sometimes when they have power. If that's the issue, I just don't see how people can disagree with Roger. If the claim is, oh, well, it's the Freedom of Information Act, that's the problem, well, that looks like a contingent objection to the particular formulation of the Freedom of Information Act and bad journalism.
My question's around this all seems to be about trying to hold people to account and to exposing wrongdoing in various different guises. My problem with transparency is that it feels a very passive thing. It's something that other people do for you. It's a set of rules and processes that are put in place to expose wrongdoing by others. Your example, Roger, I thought was really interesting about Panorama because it felt the opposite to transparency. You're the active agent, the active documenter, the active journalist investigating, getting to the bottom of things. In as transparent as world we may ever have, if you don't have the active agent, you will never expose the wrong, get to the bottom of things. So our problem is not that we need more. My question is, surely that we want to flip it on its head. We're not really interested in transparency. We're interested in living a world which is much more demanding, challenging, and testing of those who have authority over us.
There's a very interesting debate between those who believe in greater transparency, that they have a right to know everything, and those who believe that there's a right to to privacy, and we shouldn't have a CCTV camera on the end of every street, and we shouldn't have our telephone calls tapped. And the real mystery to me is often they're the same people who believe in transparency for governments but think they've got a right to privacy. And I think I defend the right of the Boy Scouts to privacy. You choose to join the Boy Scouts or not, or choose to join, and if you don't like the way they set up their rules, then you change them. You choose to be a Catholic if you want to be a Catholic. I don't think, if Catholics don't want to know what's going on in their church, that's up to them. I think I only have a right to know what governments. When I'm forced to belong to something, I expect to be able to have it scrutinised. If a private club wants to set themselves up and do things in privacy, none of my business, none of anyone else's business.
I guess I'm looking at this idea of transparency and privacy, and it kind of reminds me of a poker game, where everyone sort of thinks they want to keep their own cards secret, but they want to know the others, and then everyone assumes that everyone's lying about it. So it's kind of, is this whole sort of, you know, the paranoia in the situation actually leading to just less trust? And by having a more transparent society, are we actually just making ourselves more paranoid?
I mean, I've recently been working for a council, you mentioned planning, Roger, that puts every single email, notes of meeting, everything that the officers, the members do on its website. It has a system that automatically puts it on the website. It's completely upfront. It's a horrible place to work for, but it's all there. And I tell you, the quality of the decisions is the worst of any council I've worked for. It's, you know, because the decisions just cannot be properly taken. You cannot write an email to the chief executive with any real substance or content, because you know that it's going to be used against you or the council or someone else, a third party who will then get a judicial review or whatever. And every decision is being challenged and broken down and litigized. So that sort of transparency in an organisation does not work. It does not help to make the organisation work to the real benefit of people. And I just want to clarify, try and clarify in the debate, very briefly, transparency for whom? Because we're talking, you know, there seems to be a great conflation between people who want transparency for people of those that control us, but the state and representatives of the state want us to be transparent and say we've got something to hide. Well, I've got lots of things to hide. I'm 60 years old. I've lived a life. I've got plenty to hide, right? And I intend to keep it that way.
Yeah.
Roger, I think those films you made about Great Ormond Street Hospital were very, very good. But you wouldn't necessarily want to have cameras and microphones on everything that went on in that hospital all the time, forever. And I think the problem with trying to defend transparency as a thing in itself is that many people would take it that way, especially when it's applied to people in public responsibility. And I think that would turn them into performers. If you think of somebody who can live under the cameras 24 hours a day, the most successful at it we've ever had is Jade Goody. And she's an odd person, a really odd person, because her appeal came down to her authenticity, because she didn't seem to kind of understand that she was being sort of filmed all the time and didn't seem to understand her actual situation. And that's what made her so compelling, and a sort of a princess died from the wrong side of the tracks and all the other kind of things around a funeral. Even a funeral became a big thing. We can't make our politicians and our doctors and our big business people and all the rest of it into those kinds of, kind of ghoulish centres for puerile kind of looking at. We do need our own private space, and so do they.
So just coming to the question here, well, what's wrong with it? I think that it's the idea of transparency, which I think what you're getting at, Claire, that transparency being something that you can apply all the time to all situations, becoming somehow an end in itself, a good in itself. And I think that's the real problem here. Because, of course, you might say that in the pharmaceutical industry it would pay to open up research. Certainly drugs would be developed more quickly, and blind alleys would be avoided. So, yes, let's share all that information. And certainly, if my kids go to the Boy Scouts, I'm not quite as relaxed about it as the guy at the front. Yes, I would like to know, whether Jimmy Savile is, Anyway, so, there are things, obviously, that you want to be transparent about. But if you then apply that word to everything, then what it kind of creates is that if you're against transparency, you've got something to hide, which again I think you touched on earlier. Anybody who opposes transparency must have something to hide, and that must be a negative thing. And I think it then goes further as well, which is where I thought Andrew's points were fantastic, his earlier points, about the public and private. Because what it then does is it really does collapse that, because if you're saying everything should be transparent, and you're saying, and if you're against transparency, you've got something to hide, then where does that leave the private sphere? It means that everything we think, we've got no space to think something, we've got no space to experiment. And I think what's happening is people are giving this up too readily. People are kind of a bit complacent, really, in championing and parroting and sort of using this phrase transparency all the time. I think they're not quite realizing that they are giving up this private sphere at quite a rapid rate under this guise of transparency. And we're going to look around soon and suddenly discover that there's not much left that we can keep to ourselves. I'm looking forward to getting to 60 with some secrets, but, you know, may not.
The idea that Joe Blogs can somehow take all of this data and make it into something understandable and appreciable and interpretable, and that's a real challenge, and it's no wonder that we have such an obsession with politician A's personal life. It's probably the only thing we can actually understand as a result of transparency, really. Just wondered what the panelists' opinions on that would be.
The other thing that's going on here, and you're right, Amy, it's interesting your thing about WikiLeaks, is that we live in an age where we're less and less trustful towards authority, but we're also less and less engaged in understanding the world. Lazier and lazier. We live in an attention economy where we don't have the time or the intellectual energy or the inquiry to actually understand the world. So there were, in response to WikiLeaks, there were serious newspapers like the Financial Times or the New York Times. There were substantial articles interpreting the WikiLeaks. I'm not saying you wouldn't have read them, but most people didn't. Most people want that sensationalist, finger-pointing kind of conclusion. So I think it's all very well to criticize elites. And by the way, in terms of, I think what Roger's doing is great. I'm not saying we shouldn't have filmmakers like Roger. I think they're essential to democracy. I just don't want our entire democracy, everyone on the internet, to become like Roger, which is what's happening. But I do think that we have a responsibility to give the benefit of the doubt to people with power, and rather than shy away from power, begin to understand it, appreciate it, and understand that it goes with privacy, and perhaps even sometimes with lying.
Is transparency just about exposing wrong? No, it's not. Transparency is, if I'm accountable to you, you need to know what I'm doing, what decisions I'm making, and you need to be able to judge that. And that's transparency. It doesn't mean you're trying to find out that, you know, whatever I've done is the wrong decision or I've acted badly. So what should transparency be then? Responsible transparency, and again, I can't remember whether it was your point or the gentleman in front of you, it should be an active process. It shouldn't be passive. It shouldn't be opening up my doors and saying you can see everything. I should be thinking about who are my stakeholders, who has a right to understand what I've done, and how can I tell them in a way that they can understand, not just putting every single email on the website. That doesn't help me. So that's what I mean by responsible transparency, and I think people are lazy about it, pretend they're being transparent by throwing out a load of information that actually is very unhelpful and is opaque. And then I think where I'd like to end is that we're talking about transparency like it's a binary concept. You're either transparent or you're opaque, and it's much more difficult than that. Inherently, it's a really, really judgmental area. How can I translate data in a way that people are going to be able to use? So I don't think it's as simple as making that binary decision.
So, you know, I agree, transparency is not an absolute value. You know, it has to be qualified, but I would still repeat what I said earlier, which is it's ultimately it's the only thing that you get will hold governments to account, and it needs to be. And there are different ways of doing that. Transparency, freedom of information, and so on is one way of doing that.
The gentleman at the back who was talking about whether I wanted to have cameras everywhere. I don't. There's a big difference between voyeurism, which is what Big Brother was and the reality shows are and all, where you get ordinary people and they're watched and manipulated up, down, and sideways. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about holding power to account through transparency about decisions they are making that affect us. Okay? Not if they want to go off and make deals and do things or indeed sleep with each other, and it's legal and they're consenting adults, no problem. But if Boy Scout leaders are abusing children and the leaders of the Boy Scout then hide that, like the Catholic Church did, that's not okay with me. Joining up to a Catholic Church, by all means, but you want to know what they actually do and trust that they are going to act responsibly. And they won't do it unless they know someone's going to find out.
One point on the impulse behind transparency, I mean, obviously being charitable, I think the strongest impulse behind it that people have is that somehow knowing more will strengthen our democracy, allow us to make kind of choices. But it's interesting how that has been adopted by the elites. I mean, the elites themselves have this ritual now, as I kind of outlined in my speech, where transparency for them is the answer to everything. But it's basically impression management. It's a way of absorbing themselves of the problem. But from a radical point of view, for those, and that's become, you know, if you're a radical these days, it's all about information. It's amazing how easily people are satisfied by this, just by the fact of information. I mean, is it in 2012, the best we can come up with is that some kind of FOI inquiry that reveals that wealth buys us access. That wealth buys access to politicians. Seems to me that has become what radical politics is today, and that's it. What do people do with that? They do nothing. They ask for more information. And that is what radical politics has become. It's basically a search for information which has done nothing progressive with it.
I feel I have to say something about the Catholic Church and Scouts. I think that, of course, you know, if you say, do you want the Catholic Church and the Scouts to be hiding child abuse? The answer is no. I don't think that's a good plan. But I do think it's very important to acknowledge, and somebody made the point about trust. You now can't have a closed confessional in the Catholic Church because it's seen to be problematic about what you might be doing. Basically what's happened is we don't trust people. So I think that there's a problem in society when we assume that every time we talk about the Scouts, we have to say, but we don't want child abuse going on, or we say about the Catholic Church. I mean, my general assumption is the Catholic Church is not 99.9% paedophile. What I'm saying is there is a growing sense of mistrust, which seems to only ever be satisfied by show us what's going on. And I'm posing to you that is quite possibly corrosive, and that's where I'm heading, which is not the same as saying that I think that people should be allowed to get away with paedophilia, which is almost like anyone who argues for things happening behind closed doors immediately is seen to be covering up for child abuse, is the point that I'm making.
I was interested to hear what people had to say about the downsides of more transparency, and that's what my question's about, and it's really aimed at Kirk. The last 5 years, the pharma companies have been fined billions of dollars in the US for mis-selling products, suppressing information about products, in some cases thanks to whistleblowers. I have to say I feel better for knowing the truth about those drugs, particularly since many thousands of people actually died unnecessarily because they were prescribed these drugs. Is the biggest do you really believe that a big and important downside of greater transparency is increase in cynicism? Is that the worst you can say for more transparency? Because it seems to me that that's a very small price to pay when the stakes are so high. I'm happy to be a bit more cynical, especially if it's justified, if there are people's lives at risk by the thousand.
I was just thinking about the point that the gentleman made back there, that I'd agree that transparency in and of itself doesn't build accountability, and transparency is not accountability, and that seems to be what people are looking for more so than just the release of random information. They're looking for more accountability. And transparency doesn't build trust either. Setting clear expectations and being accountable for meeting those expectations builds trust. And I think that's something that people haven't been talking about. Perhaps something you could talk about in response?
I feel like we're living in a slight moral vacuum. Do we still have a social contract?
On the one hand, I agree with this idea of responsible transparency, but for me, the reason why I can't fully support it is because I think if we were to go for responsible transparency, organizations would stage manage the actual process of releasing the information. If we think of a couple of recent political scandals, MPs' expenses, if that was done in a responsibly transparent manner, a lot of the data would not have been released. and we wouldn't have had all of the information about the salacious activities of MPs that went on. And if you think of another one, the most recent debacle with the West Coast mainline rail franchise. Again, if the government had its way, we may not have found out all the basic pure incompetency of civil servants. I don't trust the political elites and the civil servants because we are being governed by an increasingly elite world, and I don't think that they have our interests often at heart. And I think you need this radical transparency agenda to ensure that they are held accountable.
Gilly, I can't disagree with you more on most of the things you said, but I just want to interrogate one particular thing, which is you were suggesting that you needed a mechanism which allowed you to be transparent without telling everybody everything. Well, how on earth do I know that you're telling me everything that I need to know? And frankly, everything you seem to suggest is undermining the idea, first of all, that there can be such a thing as expertise, because I wouldn't have the foggiest clue, even if you told me the most minute detail of what you do, exactly how it all works, because I haven't spent as much time doing it. And what's the problem? Where's the conspiracy? Why are you not able to do this internally with the other people you work with? Are they all untrustworthy as well? There seems to be a real problem with what you're suggesting in so many respects.
The final thought is this. I suggest you look at a website called journalism.com, which is actually the press releases that have been recycled as if they were original journalism. And that you will see what I call pseudo-information, which is released in quantities that look like transparency, but in fact hide what's really going on. On relation to the Scouts and Catholic Church, of course I want respect for them. They have to earn it. And what's sad about that story is it went right up to the Vatican hiding this for 30 years. The same with the Scouts. So that's not like saying all Scouts and all Catholics are vulnerable to this. It just is that when you've got power and you misuse it by hiding the illegal and destructive acts in power, then you've got something that deserves more transparency, not total transparency.
I think the openness of the government to transparency is the only counterbalance to the increased invasion of privacy by those in power over the individual. And, you know, I'm horrified when I read the reasons that Theresa May gives for the Communications Data Act and says it'll catch criminals, save lives and protect children. And who can argue with that? But, I mean, it's really alarming. I come from a family of journalists. Ever since I was a small child, I was, exposed to this idea that, investigative journalism was a good thing. And I think that we are very lucky that we have the press in this country. And that is really, I think, one of the big bastions against tyranny on the part of those that govern us.
So the irony is that the more we have this fetish, this ideology of transparency, the less we trust. And I think that Roger's example is a very good one. I don't know if he meant it in this way, but he talked about the way in which press releases have been recycled as news. And he's right. But why is that? Because we live in a media culture where no one trusts or respects traditional journalists anymore. Newspapers are shutting down. Everyone's opening their own blog or tweeting or putting stuff on Facebook. No one trusts the authority of journalism. They claim they're part of an elite. They claim they're biased. They claim they're being bribed by one group or another. And what is the result of that? The result is the destruction of authority in media, a complete vacuum at the heart of our public culture. And that in that vacuum emerges a culture where companies can release their own press releases and claim it's news, and you don't have an investigative journalist culture which is able to expose it. So that's the tragedy, and that's the consequence of this kind of witch-hunting culture which we're all, I think, contributing to.
So I don't think mechanism is the right word, but to come to your second point, expertise. I don't want expertise to be a barrier to transparency. So if you want to invest in a company, you have the right, even though you're not an expert and maybe you're not an accountant, to understand what you're investing in. And that was the point I was trying to make. My final point, I've talked throughout about the fact that I support responsible transparency, but I wanted to pick up one of Andrew's points. If we live in a world where as a general public, we're in a political vacuum and we just don't care, then the whole debate becomes meaningless. So we have to want to take what we get and work with it and use it and challenge.
I do want to talk about responsibility and how irresponsible WikiLeaks is, but I'll come back to the question the guy raised over there. I mean, obviously I'm in no position to defend the global practices of the pharmaceutical industry, However, if you read, which I would suggest you don't do because it's really boring, if you read Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, which is his current book, which is investigating the pharmaceutical industry, what is really noticeable about his book is that there's virtually about 3 sentences out of 420 pages where he talks about the benefits that have accrued from the development of drugs. And that's one of the problems we have, actually, is that in the rush to kind of condemn the pharmaceutical industry, he can't even bring himself to talk about the millions of people's lives who have been saved through drug development and lives have been improved. And I think the response of the pharmaceutical industry to this whole situation is misplaced because they're now, as I said, going to put everything, every penny they spend to health providers and lobbying on the internet. And you just know that won't be enough. It'll just, by doing that, it doesn't placate people. It just creates this kind of, and rather than boldly saying, you know, we have developed these drugs which have benefited humanity, you know, people's lives have been benefited from it, their response is not to do that, is a defensive one, which is to say, we'll tell you everything. And by telling people everything, they will not be satisfied by it.
Thank you very much.